Welcome back, everybody. Sorry to interrupt those informal conversations, but want to get the right balance between the sessions and the breaks. And want to thank Catherine and the participants in our first panel for getting us going. A lot of questions were raised. We got some new directions, some creative thinking there. There were hands raised at the end of the session we couldn't hear from. We're going to make sure to leave plenty of time, as Catherine did, for questions and comments from the audience. And feel free, if you had a point from the earlier session that you really want to get out there, to share that as well when we move to the wider discussion. So this is our second session on energy security for a sustainable future. And if you think about the three policy priorities that the Trump administration has articulated for its G20 presidency, this is the most, I would say, difficult for religious communities, for interfaith networks to engage with. AI and human dignity, there's some bridges we can build there. We saw in the first panel that on issues of economic growth and the common good, there are ways to engage constructively with the Trump administration. It's much harder around what we call here an energy security agenda, might better be described as an energy abundance agenda. Goes colloquially by the name drill baby drill. Okay, so just unfettered openness of markets for oil, natural gas, and coal, combined with a denial of the crisis of human-centered, human-generated climate change. That's a very stark contrast with the green transition. Laudato Si was mentioned earlier, with the efforts of most, not all, but most religious communities across the Abrahamic traditions to move us quickly into a sustainable future and reliance on renewables. In the background paper, really a discussion paper that I put together in trying to think about possible bridges, the thing that I built out, again, it's very speculative, is the core overlap on issues of access to affordable energy for people around the world, including in the global south. Very different ways of conceptualizing that, but it relates back to social justice imperatives, teachings across our traditions, the demonstrable link between energy access, economic growth, and poverty reduction. Think of what's going on now with this terrible war and the horrible cost, not just economic cost, not just gas prices in this country, but across the global south in terms of the impact on everyday life and life chances. We heard it's already going to have impacts perhaps akin to the COVID-19 pandemic going forward. So we know that access to energy is important for growth and for poverty reduction. We also know that the global community is behind in its efforts to live up to the Paris Accords, that the transfers are not being made that should be made, that have been pledged to help countries in the global south with their energy transition. So the question posed in the paper, just one thing we want to discuss is there a case to be made for a mixed regime of renewable and non-renewable energy for a transition period? And is that something that religious communities can and should engage with that possibility? That's really very much in the spirit of a discussion paper, and I know we'll have an interesting exchange on that question. The broader set of issues we want to look at are outlined here in the three questions that our colleagues will address with us. They are: how do religious values and practices relate to energy security? Are there effective ways to combine increased energy production with sustainable progress on climate change? And what are some positive examples of religious impact in this area? We've got three great colleagues who are going to address this from very different perspectives. They're going to have a chance to introduce themselves and their work and lay out some preliminary ideas in 4 to 5 minutes. we'll take the conversation on stage, see where it goes, and as I said, leave plenty of time to engage with you all. So I'd first like to turn to Rabbi Jenny Rosen, and then we'll hear from from Nancy Tuckman and Aza Karam in that order, leaders in their fields who, as I said, will have a chance to introduce their work and its relevance to us. So, Jenny, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you for convening this really important conversation. It's my first time at Georgetown. I understand what all the hype is about. What a beautiful
This
place.
is a typical space. Yeah.
Typical space, yeah.
Yeah,
it's just like New York City. I'm Rabbi Jenny Rosen. I'm the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And I have spent the last 30 years of my rabbinate mobilizing the American Jewish community together with other communities, other faith communities, and other communities of all kinds to confront social issues with a firm belief that faith communities have a really important role to play in the shaping of our collective future. And Dayenu is a Jewish organization that seeks to mobilize the American Jewish community together with other communities to confront the climate crisis, we like to say, with spiritual audacity and bold political action. It is hard to imagine a time when, at least in recent history, when we have more been in need of values, of moral leadership, and of thriving community, which are three things that I think faith communities bring in spades. And I want to address really the first question around what are core values of faith that should be brought to bear on the climate crisis and this question. There are an infinite number of values, and I really want to go back to core basics, kind of the foundational set of values that I think are shared across faith traditions and that need to undergird any conversation about how faith communities inform approaches to addressing the climate crisis. The first is simply the value of human life. In Jewish tradition, we talk about every human being being created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And this means that every human being is deserving of clean air to breathe and water to drink and food to eat and shelter, and I would say energy that enlivens and sustains them and their communities, not that destroys their health or their land. And every human being, I think, is equal means that there's also a mandate to protect the most vulnerable, something that I know is a concept that is shared across faith traditions, always asking who do we center when we're looking at solutions to the climate crisis and the pursuit of energy security. Because we know that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts communities that are historically marginalized, whether that's in this country, brown, black, poor communities, or certainly internationally when we think about the global South. And these are the same communities that often have the least access to renewable energy. The climate crisis is a force multiplier in some ways of inequity, and we see this playing out in climate over and over and over again. So I think the fundamental value of every human being has to be the place from which we start. Two, I think that one of the unique contributions that communities of faith make is the long perspective. In Jewish tradition, we talk about living lador vador, from generation to generation. But broadly, faith and faith communities have a long arc of history, right? We invoke our ancestors in our speech, in our prayer. We value creation care, and we hold a long view. And at a time when so much is driven by immediate results, immediate profit, short term, I'm sure we'll talk about this in the AI conversation as well, we value the long term, investing in future generations and protecting our collective future. And I think when we talk about continuation of fossil fuels, this is in some ways the ultimate focus on the immediate term at the expense of ongoing sustainability. Finally, a third value is imagination. the ability to envision a different future, something that every faith tradition has at its core. It looks different in different faith traditions, but our religious traditions remind us that a different world is possible. And we hold out a vision of what that world could be. And I think we're at a time when we need nothing less than radical imagination. Energy security means envisioning and building something very different than we have had before. A system that sustains all people and communities to live full and healthy lives and to thrive. And I think in this time when doom and despair and kind of the cycles of what can sometimes result, particularly for younger generations, in almost a nihilism, this is a time where we need the radical imagination and the inspiration and the faith part of faith communities, that a different kind of future is possible. I believe that these three values, the equality of every human being, the ability to have a long view, and imagination, the sort of moral and radical imagination, are three values that are among the reasons why faith leaders have nearly universally rejected the false frame that we have from the administration of energy abundance. I think even for us to continue to use that term is to reinforce a frame that is in an anathema, I think, to most, virtually all faith communities and leaders. And the continued deployment of fossil fuel infrastructure claiming that it is a benefit to the global South. As noted in Tom's paper, even Catholic leaders in the global South itself have rejected a positive affirmation of fossil fuels use as an economic development. So the African Bishops' Conference states we must stop the expansion of fossil fuels and instead expand clean, renewable energy solutions. So I'll just close this little brief part of the conversation by saying, perhaps controversially and respectfully, that I think the premise that religious leaders and institutions should facilitate practical ways forward, that we should facilitate a constructive dialogue on both sides of the abundance sustainability divide, is to ask faith communities to sanction the position that is held by an administration that denies the climate crisis, that is very much tied to the fossil fuel industry, and to lend our moral authority to a set of false premises by accepting that frame. An agenda that the abundance agenda and the green transition are somehow two reasonable paths forward, when we know that that is simply not the case. We know, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about this, that renewables, even in the global South, are less expensive. This is a false dichotomy to be set up in this way. And I fear that when we accept such a frame, we are abandoning our values. And that is what, at the end of the day, gives faith communities and faith leaders our moral authority. So I think that we need to be looking at this from a position in which we can set forward what that vision could be. I appreciate what was said earlier about not saying things that just sound nice to us. I don't think it's a matter of saying things that sound nice to us. I think if there was ever a time for there to be faith communities standing up for the moral values and the vision of what is possible, it is now. And I trust we'll have more of a chance to discuss this.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I love the emphasis on the long view and imagination. And I think we do need to be imaginative in this area for the reasons you laid out. And that's something we can come back to. Nancy, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Jenny, for teeing that up. I couldn't agree more with your thinking on how we can't talk about this climate crisis as something that we can kick the can down the road and we can keep using fossil fuels for the time being. We're simply stealing the future currently, and we're selling it in the present, and we're calling it gross domestic product. I want to talk about what is happening in faith communities that is really moving the agenda forward, moving the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy quickly and in a just way. And I'm partial to the Jesuits because even though I'm not Catholic, I was raised Episcopalian and then I married a Jewish guy, so maybe I'm religiously confused. But I love the Jesuits, and I totally drank the Kool-Aid almost 40 years ago and have been working with them on this agenda for many decades. And I come from Loyola University, Chicago, where we were able to take a very big 3-campus university with a lot of old buildings and make it carbon neutral. We achieved carbon neutrality a couple of years ago. Now we're working on decarbonizing, so it can be done. And we've also integrated environmental issues and environmental justice across the curriculum and built a school of environmental sustainability, which really attracts a lot of students. We have over 500 students now. So this is one exemplar in the Jesuit network, but the Jesuits do a lot of their ministry, maybe most of their ministry, through education, believing that education is a very powerful tool for social change. And for educators, I mean, that's really empowering and it gives us agency. And of course, Pope Francis gave us the wonderful compass of do more, do it more quickly, because the degradation of the planet and of the environment means the biggest burden on people that are marginalized and people that are poor. So it's a justice issue, it's a social justice issue, and we're way behind on moving it forward. But I think I'm proud to be affiliated with Jesuit universities because they've really taken it seriously, both in the Society of Jesus, having it as one of their sort of 4 strategies, or they call them universal apostolic preferences, is caring for our common home. And of course, Laudato Si gave us another piece of that compass that shows us the way to go and how to get there. So I will just say one more thing about Jesuit higher ed. It's the largest network of higher ed on the entire planet. There are 187 Jesuit universities worldwide in almost every country in the world. And they're really, what's cool about working with the Jesuits is that they all have the same mission, they're all moving in the same direction, and they all have the same ideals. So you can work with one university and then transfer, what worked there to another university, and it's a good way to exchange ideas and move things forward. So it's not just Loyola University Chicago that has moved forward pretty rapidly and pretty sufficiently on the environment, but there are many exemplar Jesuit universities around the world. And just to name a few, I would say Santa Clara, also in the United States, is doing terrific things. The University of Ateneo in the Philippines is really knocking it out of the park, doing terrific things on the environment. And so is Javeriana in Bogota, Colombia. And of course, Loyola University Andalusia in Seville, Spain. That's a brand new university, but they're already LEED Platinum and doing terrific things. I want to talk about, not just the Jesuits and the work that they do and how they're bringing spirituality and justice into the climate problem. But in this country, even though Donald Trump has taken us out of the Paris Agreement, one of the very first things that he did the first time he was in office, and he did it again the second time that he was in office. And Tom, you mentioned early on that we're having difficulty engaging with the federal government on influencing policy. But I think there's an enormous role for grassroots work towards environmental, working on climate change, working on environmental integrity. And one terrific example is the biggest coalition on climate change in the US called it's called now America is All In. It used to be called, the first time Trump pulled us out, it was called we are still in. Now it's called America is All In. It's the largest climate coalition in the US, and it holds a strategy for a faster and more durable emissions reductions. And the idea is that there are thousands of faith communities, universities, businesses, cities, even states. There are 10 full states that have pledged in their organization or in their region, they are still in the Paris Accord. And that means that they are reducing fossil fuel emissions by 50% compared to the 2005 levels of emissions by the year 2030, and becoming carbon neutral by 2050. And in my opinion, that's nowhere near fast enough, but at least the trajectory is set and the direction of movement is in the right direction. And this kind of work with this coalition and the size of it, let me just read a couple of these numbers to you. There are 368 cities that are in the America is All In movement, 14 tribal nations, 10 states, 3,032 businesses, 851 faith groups, 431 universities, cultural institutions, healthcare organizations. When you add up all the people that are in this coalition, it's 2/3 of the country. 2/3 of the population of this country are still in the Paris Accord. And you know what? When you look at the GDP of all of these organizations, it's 75% of our country's GDP. So we're still in the Paris Accord. You know, maybe the federal government, we're not engaging with them, and they're trying to turn things in the opposite direction. But they're the ones, facing the headwinds, because the grassroots American community is still in the Paris Accord and still wanting and understanding this is the right way to go. It's the just way, and it's the best way for future. So I find that super hopeful. And I would just recommend people, if you aren't aware of it, look on the website. And if you own a business or if you belong to a university that's not in, you should be in. Okay, I'm gonna let you go ahead because I probably went over time.
No.
Okay.
This is great. Thanks, Nancy. Asa, over to you. Yeah.
Well, I want to affirm what the two speakers have said. I also have a bit of a struggle internally trying to see how we can marry the concept of energy abundance with basically what is really a finite planet and planetary resources. But I also understand, I am so sorry. I should have begun by saying Eid al-Adha Mubarak to everybody, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here in DC and meet my everyone, but especially my Muslim brothers and sisters. So thank you for that opportunity. This is a very important moment for Muslims, so one cannot just ignore it. So, okay.
And please introduce yourself too.
I'm sorry, yes, my name is Azza Karam, and I am delighted to meet many of you whom I have had the distinct privilege of crisscrossing paths with over the last 26 years. It's a joy to be here. I happen to, I have founded, together with a group of people, one of my partners is here, Vina O'Sullivan. We have an international consultancy, and it's the first women of faith-led international consultancy in the world. And we are also calling ourselves a house of wisdom. And I'm here representing it together with Vina. One of the things that I have learned over the last 27 years is that our world of faith-based engagement, Catherine, is something that could do with some serious self-reflection. But I was going to say before that I think we are in a very critical period in our lives, not only because of all the so-called polycrises, but also because we are confronted with a very existential question, which is what do we do when the ruling regimes, because it's not just this one, but almost all over the world now in every corner, the ruling regimes tend to adopt a particular perspective which is inherently abusive of our natural resources, but also of our humanity and dignity as vulnerable, the most vulnerable amongst us. And so I think we do have to figure out not only how we can stand in opposition and be resilient in our opposition, as we are at the same time being constructive in our engagement with one another, but we also have to figure out how to not only be in opposition. And I think that that is proving to be extremely difficult for civil societies in general. But I also have to say, it's not something that the religious world as such, the religious realms as such, have necessarily proved adept at doing together. I think what we're noticing is that there's a tremendous amount of resilience and goodwill and constructive energy around the environment, that it has become a very powerful mobilizing factor across secular and religious spaces. But I think we're still struggling to work in the Enlightenment mode of silos. So we seem to think that the climate is its own separate set of things. Peace and mediation is its own separate set of things. Education, gender, etc., as if every one of these is an island somehow. And our challenge is precisely that these are all very strongly interconnected. So where there are wars, and unfortunately they're plentiful, that also means dramatic degradation of environmental resources and a tremendous annihilation of a sense of self-dignity for our humanity. And these are things that are happening at the same time. So we're still approaching them in silos when in fact they are very deeply interconnected, and we're struggling with the interconnectedness at the same time that we're struggling with very oppressive regimes which have become the new normal everywhere, including in democratically elected contexts. So it seems to me that perhaps one of the things, and thank you for the enlightenment, Nancy, about how, in fact, at the civil society level, at least one can say, there is a remarkable resilience in what not only the religious, but the multi-religious and the secular are doing to confront. But we also, I think, need to do what was mentioned, I believe, by Chris Seipel and others in the last session, which is a little bit of more critical self-reflection within the religious realms. The only thing that I would question is this terminology of the faith sector. I remember working in the UN and we started talking about faith-based organizations. And it was my guru, Catherine Marshall, who said, now wait a minute, what does that even mean? What is this terminology? Mm-hmm. So I would have to kind of say, well, you know what does the faith sector really mean? And the term has been used repeatedly, and I think we need to be a bit careful. One of the problems that we are encountering when we talk about the planet as a whole and our interdependence is that we tend to think that there's such a thing as a faith sector. And the truth is that the faith sector is just as divided as everybody else and everything else. And even when we speak about interfaith or multi-religious, and that's been something I've been working on for the last 30 plus years, I can tell you that there is the mirage, and then there's the reality. And the reality is that just as we have seen secular political positions become more divided, more problematic, more to the right or more to the left, we are also seeing that in the religious worlds as well. And so the religious world is mirroring a lot of what's going on in the secular context. And given that the secular contexts are not exactly coherent and cohesive and collaborative, the religious world isn't that either. The paper does a very good job of sharing what's going on in the different domains of Islamic and Catholic and so on. But that is precisely the issue, that we have so-called interfaith positions, but actually these are not common positions. So the interfaith positions are as bifurcated, as divided as everything else. Let me speak to the Islamic context in particular, because I can see that even in the Muslim world, precisely as the last couple of COPs have demonstrated, there are Muslim leaders and Muslim institutions which are actually very much in support of the fossil fuel, or at least will be quiet about the fossil fuel dimension, because they're intimately connected to the states which are producing and which have a vested interest in making sure that fossil fuels remain our future for some time to come. So can we actually speak of an Islamic position in that case when it is divided according to who's in power and where the money comes from? And given that we can't speak of a unified Islamic position, I don't quite see how we can speak of a faith sector position. Which brings me to a point that I think it's foundational, but then I have worked with the United Nations and other international organizations for most of my career, so I kind of seem to see the world from that perspective. We have a crisis of multilateralism, and people still don't seem to understand that that really basically means a crisis of collaboration. It isn't about governments or non-governments, so it's a crisis of collaboration. Now, unfortunately, the crisis of collaboration is mostly evident in what we would call, for lack of a better word, the good causes. And certainly the environment is one of the most strategic good causes there is, because we can't exist if this planet doesn't. So it really is rather foundational. We're seeing a crisis of collaboration in general. And what we see happen in terms of the total disregard for international law in general is actually a very serious danger to our coexistence. It is a serious danger to our environment. So why are we surprised when we see that the narrative is one that says we are in abundance when we are actually in anything but? But if we don't stand together to address it, and if we only stand in our silos, this is the Jewish silo, this is the Muslim silo, this is the Catholic silo, this is the other Christian, if one can say that, silos, etc., etc., etc. If we keep doing that, which we are, and doing a very good job of it, by the way, within each of these different silos, we're doing a very fine job, but the point is we're in silos. And the existential crisis is one of collaboration. And it does require having to come to terms with dramatically different perspectives on very basic things. What we've seen happen after October 7 has created an even wider rift within our religious communities and in our secular communities than existed before. And this isn't only about the climate. This is about how we actually see the value of life itself. And I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we are deeply divided amongst ourselves, even in the religious world, but we are also deeply divided in the secular world. And we're proceeding to try to build bridges when in fact the bridges are being destroyed rather dramatically. So how do you build bridges when they get shot down and destroyed? And the question here is, at what point, what is it going to take for us to appreciate that we still have to collaborate precisely because we differ, precisely because we are on opposite ends of every single spectrum that has ever existed in humankind. And the challenge is, for the longest time, I always thought that the religious communities could provide that way of building the bridges in spite of the differences. I always thought that if you're a believer, you could build the bridges because you had to build the bridges because you believed in something longer, more valuable, more phenomenal, more foundational. But we are in a moment where we're noticing that even the religious sectors as such are not able to build the bridges. Why not? Why are our religious spaces not honoring and enabling those very same things that we need at this moment in time? And unless and until we ask that question, we will not be able to save our planet. We will continue to work in silos. We will continue to see the faith sector as though it was a separate, distinct thing. And we will miss out on the fact that we are unable to extend our hands towards one another at the moment when we need to do so most. Because we're all hurting. And some of those who are leading us as religious leaders may be hurting the most, and therefore the least able to help us hold our hands together. Let's face this reality. Let's look at it. Let's look at what's missing in the interfaith, multi-religious worlds, instead of assuming that we will be able to sort it out just by having a faith sector collaborate with a secular sector when both of them are suffering deeply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azza. Thanks to all of you for very thought-provoking presentations. I sensed some consensus around the futility, let's say, of engaging with the Trump administration and its priorities around energy security. We tried to recruit someone from the Trump administration to join us on this panel, in which case there would not have been consensus. But that did not work out. So here we are, and maybe in the question and answer, there are other views on the compatibility or not, or the value of trying to engage at this intersection of abundance and green transition, the inevitability of fossil fuel use, especially in the global south for a bridge period, something that's worth talking about, or not. But I want to come back to something each of you touched on and ask a question here before we open it up. If we bracket for a second the utility of engaging with the Trump administration, you've each been active for a long time in your respective faith communities as well as in interfaith conversations, the Jewish, the Catholic, and the Muslim. And so you've tried to build coalitions internally. And part of that has involved outreach to business people, more conservative folks, people more concerned about energy access and about the green transition. And there's been tremendous success in building coalitions that encompass and reach out to and bring in those folks. Can you say something about what has worked and what has not worked internally in the effort to broaden the coalition politically to the center and even to the conservative side of the aisle? Jenny? Yeah.
Well, I'll start by saying that I would say that a few years ago there was a study done about 10, 12 years ago that showed that 80% of the American Jewish community was either concerned or very concerned about the climate crisis. That number has no doubt increased since then because we know that's true for the American people as a whole. So our focus has really been not on trying to reach the 10 or 15% who are not, but how do we most effectively activate and engage the 85% that are. So I think that there's often an issue of moving people from what I call angst to action, and have really focused on how do we most effectively bring faith communities, the Jewish community, to effective climate action and to addressing the climate crisis. So with the sort of caveat that our focus has really been on activating those who are on board. And I think to your point, Nancy, I actually think that we have the majority, and I mean this in the largest sense, on our side. And I think it's a really foundational question whether we should be in this moment of trying to bring everyone together to a shared common vision, or should we be trying to more effectively advocate for the kinds of addressing of the climate crisis that we know economically, scientifically, morally to be right. So I guess would challenge the question of whether the primary focus should be winning them over.
Got it. Very good. Nancy, what do you think?
And I agree with that. I don't think we have the time to work with the minority of people. And by the way, we're pretty much the only country that has people that are climate deniers. Most of the world is ahead of us in terms of understanding what needs to be done and how to get there, especially Europe, and they're great exemplars for us. But my experience over my whole career has been with young people, and they're the most frightened and filled with anxiety and depression that we're not moving fast enough, and they see this calamity and all the suffering that's already happening but will become much more amplified. And what helps them is, one, their spirituality and their faith. But not all kids have that, and they can't all rely on, they all have a spirituality, but many of them aren't even in touch with the fact that they have their own human spirituality. So drawing that out of them is one thing. But action, and action by old people like us in this room is so important to give them hope. that somebody cares and somebody's doing something about it. You know, not just talking about it and saying what a crisis it is, but showing that we can make a difference, and it can be grassroots, it can be something small in your own family, in your own home. That gives youth hope that we can change. You know, and I think the biggest hurdle that we have in this country is will, because every one of us in this room enjoys the luxury of being able to fly when we want to fly, and being able to, you know, afford gasoline. Even if it's $6 a gallon, we still fill up our tanks and we still drive. And we are not super willing to give up our air conditioning and to give up our heating. And we're not really willing to sacrifice. We just want to see the country move to clean energy without there being very much pain. And I think young people understand that that's an impossibility. There has to be some pain. We have to give something up, at least temporarily, until we make that transition and get all of this infrastructure in place. So it's sort of like, you know, we're like this collective pregnant woman who's just about to go into labor, but the woman is like, I don't want to do this now. I want to go home, you know, just, you know, I don't want to have this baby. It's too much pain, and I'm now looking forward to this delivery process. But we want the young, healthy child at the other side. You know, there's that threshold that we have to go through, and I think our will is, you know, less than excited about doing that. So we keep kicking this can down the road. But anyway, I think we really have to move into action. We have to be good examples of leadership to young people to give them hope. And the most unfair thing that we can do to Generation Z is to say, boy, are we glad that you guys get this environmental thing, because you're going to solve this problem for us. You know, they don't have any knowledge, they don't have any money, they don't have any connections. We're the ones with the experience, the connections, and we should take that responsibility. And yes, they can be the fuel that flames our fire, but we have to be the leaders that move this problem forward, so that they aren't just inheriting an impossible, you know, Sisyphus kind of trying to move this big, huge rock up a mountain all by themselves. So please don't ever tell young people that you're so glad that they understand the climate crisis and that they're going to pull us out of this and that we have faith in them, because that's just a huge burden that's not fair for them to have to shoulder.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah.
I think I can speak to the context of that. For the longest time, we were sharing the data and the statistics about what was going on in the environment. And until now, you will see that there are, at least in the Muslim world, there are still those who will continue to abide by whatever the political regimes or the business regimes say to them and decide will happen. But the needle started to move on not just awareness but action when it became clear that it wasn't just Muslims speaking to the Muslim dynamic. It became clear that this was not only multi-religious concern, but it is a global concern. And I think those things do have an impact at the end of the day. Like with other issues, and Catherine knows the history of some of the difficulties of getting some of certain issues on the religious tables, such as gender equality, etc., the needle begins to move better, move at all, or move faster when the conversation is no longer rooted to only one religious community. It is being hosted multilaterally, multi-religiously, and somehow other people seeing this and other people being concerned makes a difference to these communities. So I think that is also why I was speaking so much about the multi-religious and the interfaith, because those can be spaces of genuine dynamic shifting of awareness and engagement and action. And if they fail us, or if they become too undynamic, I don't know what the word is, it can hurt the rest of us badly.
Thank you. So we've got 30 minutes now for a wider conversation. Please, we've got a roving mic right here, and we'll start here in the middle. Maybe collect several questions and observations before we get back to the panel, and you all can respond to whatever you like. Yes?
Thank you. I'm Richard Fulton. I'm with the Freedom Forum. First of all, Tom, I want to take you up on the offer you made earlier to just raise a point I wanted to make in the earlier session, which is that as we talk about the instrumentalization of religious entities and interests by the state, instrumentalization, it's an easy word to say, goes both ways. That is, we also have to be concerned about those who want to instrumentalize the state to serve religious ends that the state has no business serving. So that's just a comment from before. Second, on this issue, I'm hearkening back. I did work when I was at the American Jewish Committee. I was doing work about 12, 15 years ago on energy security. And without in any way wanting to suggest you should reduce your passion, your activity on the climate change issue, I think there's also a question is how do you reach those unique American climate deniers, maybe in Congress, maybe the administration is a lost cause, but certainly in Congress, maybe there are people that whose attention you might get, who need to hear that reliance on fossil fuels is not in the service of energy security. That in fact we have seen in the last couple of months very, very explicitly that if we rely on fossil fuels, it can be weaponized against us. Whatever you think about what it should be done to serve American interests, we don't get to serve those American interests in the way we think we ought to if the access to fossil fuels is used as a weapon. Even if it's abundant in this country, it's a global market, prices are going to go up, and at the end of the day, we may not even have the access we think we do. So, what I want to suggest to those who are advocates and are looking for ways in which to convey a message is that we need to make clear that it's not energy security or dealing with climate change. Our energy security is not being served by our dependence on fossil fuel, the issue of climate change aside.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. My name is Afifa Saeed. I also wanted to kind of hark back to the last session, but I think it's relevant as well here. Some of the work that I was doing at USAID when I was the only person tasked to do religious engagement and try to figure out why we weren't doing it right, part of it was just looking at, how are we documenting what's happening right, what's working, and what is it that we are already trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, to create the problem to solve, which has been the critique of development overall anyway, is to go around asking people for what the problems is rather what is working. And they always have a list of problems to share, because that's how we've been kind of creating this dynamic. And I know some of the times that I've been in communities to ask what's happening right, they don't have an answer because they're not used to that question. So kind of flipping the script a little bit. And then when you do ask that question and when you do engage, so I wanted to bring this from policy side down to the village community center, which could be a place of worship, and having those conversations that I don't think happen enough. So the point really for me is, I've worked with policy side, I've worked with the donor side and the implementing partner side, but we don't have enough of these conversations at that local level. We don't have enough engagement, and I say it because I hear it all the time. And asking that question of what are you doing as a religious leader or even a religious space constituted as a religious space, and then you'll find women that don't have those labels that are doing that work, et cetera, as we all know. And I know it's contentious sometimes to talk about, well, religious folk are development actors themselves or religious leaders, and some people don't want to say that and don't want to accept it. But the fact of the matter is many of them are doing those those development objectives. Mm-hmm. In fact, a conversation I had with a mullah that came from Tora Bora in Jalalabad when I was there, he gave me a list of things that he does, but the way he said it, specifically, was as a Muslim, as an imam, I follow the Prophet Muhammad and his approach to development. So I was very curious about that, and he gave the whole outline, and this is somebody who is not engaged with the secular side and didn't want to be in this conversation. And he said to the question that, that was brought up last session, he said, do you remember how the Prophet Muhammad built Medina, which is the first Islamic state? And he went down the list. And this is a man who has taken the sayings of the Prophet and told me how the Prophet built infrastructure. He built aqueducts to make sure that everybody had access to water. He built the education spaces so everybody had access to schools. He built a security force that didn't exist before. So we went down these lists, and of course they're all development objectives. And he said, that's my job. That's what I have to do as the mullah of my people. But the fact remained, does he have the capacity to do any of those things in a way that's effective? Right? So the question then becomes, who are we engaging if we're talking about all this engagement? What is the framework of that engagement? And then in this case, that I'm sure Catherine and Jared has heard me say this in terms of saying, at the end of the day, what is the capacity we're building of these folks? And for example, he told me very clearly, he said, I want to have more capacity building in domestic violence because my community is seeing that. Now this is a mullah from the mountains, but he was very clear that my father was a mullah and before him and so on, but I don't know how to deal with this particular situation. So when I took this to our folks at the embassy and implementing partners, I said, I have this religious guy with a big turban and long beard who wants to have capacity building in domestic violence. And their answer was no. We can't engage with him because he may affect the others in the room, or we won't know what he'll say. So he wasn't invited to those spaces. So here's, that becomes my contention. This was a window of opportunity we had with this particular person, but it's a pattern. It's not, just this is an exemplary of many of the conversations I've had. How are we engaging these folks? And yeah, I know this is part of the strategic engagement hub and et cetera, that the work we're doing. But in this context, I worked with folks, religious folks in Philippines who did not, so that we brought the religious leaders together to talk about environmental degradation. And they were clearly saying to all the people in the room, we've never heard of this before, as religious leaders. Mm-hmm. But as soon as they heard about it, which was really prescient, and they got the facts, they came up with a manual called the Khalifa Manual, which is how do you take care of the earth as a religious person. So that's the other piece of this, is which, when we engage them, not just to be the messengers or to development itself, but how we have that space and that ability to educate them.
Thank you.
And then connecting that to what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much. A rich set of observations we want to come back to up here. Right over here, we've got a comment. We'll take two more and then get back to the panel. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paul Eisenman. I'm another follower of Catherine Marshall's. First, I thought your paper was really excellent, and thank you for that. And I like the way it started off by being pretty honest about what the Trump administration is doing in the energy area and the divergence between the views of the administration and the views of religious communities and lots of other less religious communities. Having said that, it seems to me that we're talking. There's a danger of focusing on the G1 rather than the G20, and have to look at what the position should be from the point of view of, well, the U.S. The U.S. is the host. There's a lot of people here from the U.S., but what about the rest?
Yeah.
And if you don't speak up, if you say, well, let's see how we can accommodate, it looked pretty bad from the non-U.S. point of view, and I think it looks pretty bad within the U.S. As well. Now, as far as the global South goes, I think we have to watch out what our attitude is. Global South has what a lot of diversity we are talking about. There are some countries that have coal and nothing else. There are other countries that have wonderful opportunities for renewable energy. It's not up to us to say, here's what you ought to be doing. It's rather up to us to say, well, how can we help push the margin on the renewable, rather than saying, no, tomorrow you got to stop using fossil fuels. And I think with that kind of a push that takes account of the U.S., but not too much account of the U.S., and that disaggregates the needs of countries and allows for their differing situations. I think
Thank you.
comes back to a very good paper that you did. Thank you.
Thank you. One more comment and or question, and then we'll get back to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Rodrigo. I'm from Brazil. Well, I think one issue that perhaps it's relevant for both issues of economic regulation and deregulation, and now energy security, is what caught my attention maybe is the absence in the discussions of the issue of religious minorities and religious vulnerable groups. Because, for example, when we are talking about economic regulation and deregulation, sometimes the legal frameworks use definitions and concepts and procedures that are based on majority religion perspectives. Like sometimes even the definition of religion itself, or how that impact on the way of life of some religious or spiritual minorities. And here on energy transition, and this is, I think it's a kind of a global South perspective, but also from any part of the world. Sometimes in the transition, we don't pay attention to the issue of the minority groups or the vulnerable, for example, religious or spiritual cultures, like indigenous populations in Brazil or elsewhere in Latin America. So sometimes when you build a hydroelectrical dam, you can violate the rights of indigenous populations. That's the case law, or the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on Religious Freedom. It's all based on the issues of the violation of indigenous populations in the transition to renewable energy. So I think that's maybe that's a theme that could be included in the in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent points. So let's start with Asa, some responses to what you've heard. Yeah.
Totally agree. And I think it does bring out a very important aspect of, if you look at, you mentioned the indigenous minorities in Brazil as an example, we can now look at what's going on to some of the Shia minorities in the Sunni countries in the Gulf, which are currently having a wonderful time. I think you're absolutely correct, sir, that we and I think the paper addresses this actually rather well, which is that there are different needs, different tempos, and different momentos. The point is that we are all trying to move towards a similar situation. Some of the business leaders put this really well. They say, well, we kind of need to invest in more extraction and more fossil fuels in order to develop the kind of green that we need, which I find fascinating, but there is that way of thinking. So let's just keep extracting a little bit more until we can oil what we're going to need in order to save life. But in the meantime, we've lost quite a lot of life. But okay, I think one of the things that we have indeed not addressed, and I'm very grateful that you brought that up, is precisely how instrumentalization works both ways. I mean, I come from the Middle East. I come from a part of the world where there's been a very, very brilliant history of the religious instrumentalizing the political, and the political instrumentalizing. I mean, my goodness, we go back, till a long time. So I do think that it's worthwhile bearing that in mind, because I especially brought that out in the very beginning of my presentation, which is to say that we have to be conscious of the fact that there are certain, I said Muslim, but honestly they're in every single religious tradition, there are certain Muslim actors or religious actors who are aligned very well with the extractive industries. So it's not as if all the religious are actually on the side of the green and everyone, no. So, and I think we need to see that reality too, because it weakens the ability of some of our religious communities to work in general towards this idealized future, but it also weakens our interfaith and multi-religious capacity to mobilize. So I'm very grateful that you mentioned these points.
Thank you. Nancy?
Oh, okay. I'll respond to Richard saying, how do you reach the energy deniers that relying on fossil fuels does not make America energy more secure? The Department of Defense and the Department of Energy know this, and they've been very instrumental in moving us off of fossil fuels. But I don't know how much of those brains, how much of that goodwill and brain power has been removed from those departments. I suppose as soon as Trump finds out that they're there, they will be gone. But I think in general, the culture of the Department of Defense is very keyed into that and has been for a few decades, so that's a good thing. Paul made, is it Paul? Yeah, made a comment about some countries in the global south, they're very diverse. Some of them are dependent on coal, for example. But the current policy worldwide has never been to cut off developing nations from using fossil fuels. It's about the G20. We're the ones that are using it all and causing the problem. Focusing on the global south is almost ridiculous. It's like, what, so that we can keep polluting and these poor, small contributors, they aren't the problem. So I think someone mentioned earlier in the last panel that environment was not going to be on the topic, a topic that was going to be discussed in the G20 this year. And if it's not, that's just absolutely tragic, because you can fix all the social problems you want, but if the planet goes down the drain, there will be no life on this planet. That really should be the top priority. Honestly, it is the biggest, urgent, most ultimate problem that we have. If we don't fix this, we can't fix anything. And we're going to be in a state of emergency very quickly, all the time, with a hurricane and a wildfire and flooding and droughts and not enough food insecurity, water insecurity. That's going to be our life. It's just going to be constant, disaster after disaster. So I think what we need to think about is the G20 really getting serious about getting off of fossil fuels so that we can avert the most amount of disaster that we're heading into.
That relates to the point about getting beyond the G1 in this current administration, putting the whole G20 in the spotlight. Jenny? Yeah.
I'm so glad that you mentioned energy security, because I think that is often set up as another dichotomy that is a false dichotomy. And if, as you said, these last few months, I actually think create an opportunity that we're not necessarily, those who are concerned about the climate crisis, utilizing enough or particularly well, given that this is a tremendous example of the problem with our dependence on fossil fuels. So thank you. And I also really appreciate you raising the power of the grassroots and the importance. We're talking here, I think, about the G20, but the grassroots have huge power on those very actors. And so I think we can't only be focused here and forgo the grassroots who have a power on the power that leads to the power, and I think we sometimes forget that. So thank you. Two things that I just speak a little bit to what you said. I appreciate you saying nobody is saying they need to get off of fossil fuel. The cost, which is another false dichotomy, I think has to be talked about in greater specificity. Over the past decade, the cost of clean energy has plummeted I think solar is down 90%, wind 70%, and batteries more than 90%. So solar electricity has been the cheapest electricity on Earth since 2020. And countries with a lot of sun, even greater. So I think in 2023, the International Energy Association, or Agency, excuse me, found that new utility scale solar is the cheapest source of electricity in history, and that's cheaper than new coal, certainly cheaper than new gas. And this includes in Africa and South Asia. So again, I spoke before about values. If we want to turn, though, to some of the more pragmatic parts of the argument,
Yep.
I think the economics of it have to be stated as they are and not as they get kind of reinterpreted by the administration or their comms folks. And finally, I think we can't end this conversation without talking about the gap between the pledge and the reality of the financial support of the Global South.
Yeah.
And the G20 having not made good on those pledges. I think it's $100 billion of pledge around climate finance, and then additionally around debt relief for countries who are experiencing climate disasters. And that is a tremendous, I think, real role for the G20 that gets us out of this circle of accepting the Trump administration's framing of things and actually goes back to the commitments that the G20 has made that are an integral part of our being able to support all countries to make this transition from fossil fuel to green, clean, and renewable energy.
Thanks, and that point builds a bridge to our earlier session, Eric, discussion with some positive signs of light on debt relief and the Trump administration. Did you have a point you'd like to make? Please, the mic over here. You can project. Oh, here's the mic. Okay.
I'm never accused of people not being able to hear me. My kids complain how loud I am. So I was really grateful that you brought up that point. It was what I was going to raise, is that research since 2020 is incredibly captivating. And certainly as an issue that we've worked on, I don't see advocates making that connection enough, actually avoiding that connection. And I would imagine that given now the war, that research would even be more in our favor. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, and I'm curious how that's resonating with G20 governments as well as policymakers. And I think the other piece is I think folks may be aware, and this is happening all over the world, but in the United States, U.S. policy that has passed into law recently is that these giant AI farms have to be self-dependent on energy. So the administration has put in super tax breaks to build these gigantic solar farms all over the United States and even worldwide, that companies will get these tax breaks, while they have removed the tax breaks if you want to put it on your home. But these are multi-billion-dollar tax breaks. So I guess I'm curious how this kind of logic is resonating, and from your perspective, how much is it being used? Because I don't see that logic being utilized often enough.
Let's get two more quick comments, Tim and John, maybe. Right here. Okay.
My name is Tim Stratford. I'm actually the vice chair of the IF20's policy committee, and the chair, of course, is Catherine. I'm looking at what sort of policy recommendations we're going to make. I think we've all learned that when you want to have a conversation with someone, if you can find common ground and build from that, you're going to get a lot farther. So I'm listening to the panelists say, okay, what common ground do we have as a starting point with the host nation for the G20 this year? And I'm hearing some things that I don't think the paper emphasizes yet, but if we talk about cost, I think if you sit down and say, we agree we need to have the most economically based source of energy, and so you can start from the cost, and then you can move, based on the statistics that Jenny's given us, that this is the right path to go. And I think the Trump administration would agree that you need to have energy security as well. So if we start from that and then can make the case that goes in this direction, even if we don't talk about environment, we may still be serving the goals that we're trying to pursue. So, I mean, we can either do that, or we can decide we don't want to talk with them because they're not going to be interested in environment, or we can say we want to talk with them, but we don't mind if they're angry or not because we just want to set down a principle for future years. And I think focusing on areas where we would have common ground would probably be the most fruitful.
Thank you. Right behind you, John. Yeah.
Thanks for an excellent panel. And selfishly, I'm on the next panel, so thank you, Tom, for letting me grab the mic. I was wondering if any of you, I'm sure you are familiar with the Loss and Damage Fund. One of my heroes is Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who about 3 years ago started the Bridgetown Initiative, and to me said one of the most brilliant and unifying things, and forgive me if I get this wrong, but hold on to the IMF, to the kind of Bretton Woods foundation of modern finance. If you want to deal with the environment, you have to change essentially the power structure around money and economics. Do you see that, and Shokran, I really appreciated your comments, do you see that as an opportunity for faith-based traditions to say, if globally as faith-based leaders we can't say support the resilience, the emergency state, and she's done amazing work with Maria Mazzucato, a leading economist in Italy who I really admire, on water, right? If we can't come together and agree on water, and agree on how to deal with, and the Loss and Damage Fund, if you all don't know, it's basically saying, hey everybody, whatever we call it, the environment, anything else, the systems that drive the biosphere, we have 10 years left or whatever. We've gone 8 of the 9 planetary boundaries, we've gone over those. So anyway, long question except to say, do you see the opportunity, or I hope there might be an opportunity for all faith-based traditions to say, this is not talking about environment per se, it's the economics of understanding crisis and how much more it costs when you, especially those, okay.
So we have time for 2 final points right here, and then Erwin, and then we give the panelists a final chance to wrap up. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Highland. I'm the chair of the IF20 Human Trafficking Group, also former UK Anti-Slavery Commissioner. We're talking about engaging with the US, particularly for this G20, and this goes into the previous panel as well as this. Are we engaging with the US trade representative, who is a former BYU graduate, on the 60 economies that the Trump administration has told them to investigate for human rights violations in order to affect trade? There's a route in that is about the very subjects, whether it's being done for the right reason or not, but how are we as interfaith engaging on that piece of work? Which is a crucial piece of work, which is going to change trade over the next year or two, and the value of that trade to other countries, particularly G20 countries. And the other thing is, on talking outside of the US, the EU has just announced, up to 40 billion euros on migrants and migrant control. How is that being discussed? Because we know that many migrants are due to displacement because of climate. We know it's because of conflict. And we know that these return policies are going to put people at higher risk. And of course, the UK is adopting some of that as well. So we've got a whole series of G20 countries that are involved in those conversations. But how are we preparing to introduce those as the faith community here in the US and also in the UK next year?
Thank you. And Erwin, you have the last word here. Just pass the mic.
Hello, everybody. I'm Erwin Kyongson. I'm Director of the Global Human Development Program here at Georgetown. Thank you for this panel. So much food for thought. I wanted to echo some of the points Tim made and some points made earlier on the issue of energy security. And I've been thinking about it in terms of where are the possible bridges, where are the possible engagement points that bring together all the things we care about. And so echoing what was said earlier, maybe security is the bridge. And on that, I want to offer some really telling statistics. So if you look at some of the news articles from the last 2 months, a number of them tell us that the green transition, oddly enough, has actually accelerated since the beginning of the Iran war. And the data are really telling. Here in the US, there's been a surge in sales of EVs, electric vehicles, and hybrids by about 40%. Very much broad-based. And it's not just the G1, this is G20. So in parts of Europe, in fact, it's not just the sale of new EVs and new hybrids, but they're almost out of the used EVs and used hybrids. There's like I looked at a recent article, 160% increase in the sale of used hybrids in the UK alone. And so what is this telling us is there's revealed preference for EVs. There's a revealed preference for the green transition, but maybe not in the terms we have been describing it. It's about energy security, but it is also about affordability.
Yes.
And so then it brings together the many things we care about: protecting the vulnerable, protecting households from price volatility in a way that is consistent with people's actual purchasing behavior. And on the specific policy recommendation, how does that lead to a really specific thing that maybe we can organize ourselves around? 5 days ago, the House of Representatives here in the US put out a new proposal to, oddly enough, charge EV and hybrid owners new fees, like $130, maybe more, on new fees just by owning EVs. I would imagine that in this environment, there should be a constituency against that proposal. And it is in keeping with the many things we care about.
Thank you. These are all great comments, and they will be reflected in the next version of the paper, as well as the conversation we're having up here. Before we close, I do want to give you each a chance for a final word, maybe a response to something you've heard, something you'd like to share as we move toward our lunch break. Jenny, why don't you get us started? Yeah.
So one of the themes that I'm hearing come up repeatedly in what you opened with, Nancy, and what you just closed with, is this gap between, if you will, the people and some of our leaders. And I think that that's a really important, as people of faith and leaders of faith who work with leaders, but also with millions and millions of our people. And I think it's really important, and thank you for mentioning the acceleration of green energy during this period, and I think it has been largely unreported, but very true. You asked about whether cost is something that's being used, and we work mostly in the US, and absolutely, affordability, not surprisingly, is the word of the year. We're seeing this play out in state policy, we're all over, in ways that are both, I think, very powerful and potentially good, and in ways that are also creating false dichotomies. So in New York State, our governor just rolled back our major climate policy on the grounds of affordability, which again goes back to not having the long view. And the fact that if you can subsidize low-income families to be able to make the transition, in the long run, we're all, much better off.
Yeah.
And to your point about sacrifice, it will cost a little bit more for higher earners. The question about sacrifice is an interesting one, because I think abundance, we've been talking about it in the Trump frame. Some of us also talk about it in the Ezra Klein frame, for those of you who are in that zeitgeist. And the word Dayenu, which is the name of the organization that I lead, comes from a song that we sing at the Passover Seder every year. It's a joyous song that says, if God had taken us out of Egypt but not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. And it's a whole refrain. It would have been enough, it would have been enough. So we named our organization Dayenu with another kind of play on the meaning, which is, we've had enough. Like, there's an urgency here, enough, Dayenu. But there's a double entendre, which is that it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis. And I think we would be remiss in not remembering that we actually have the solutions, we have the technology, we have some of the great policies. What we need is the political will and the power of the people to ensure that all people can have enough.
Thank you. Nancy?
Yeah, I agree that it's about will, but the cost has come to our advantage because 15 years ago, it was much more expensive to get solar, than it was to just keep getting your electrons off the grid. Now you benefit, so I think that's really going to be a game changer. It does hurt us that the federal incentives are gone, but many of the states are stepping up, and it's too bad about New York, but many of the states are stepping up and giving incentives to, homeowners and businesses to go solar. The Catholic Climate Covenant, which is an organization based here, is a very, very progressive organization that helps people and businesses who want to put solar on their buildings by, because there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of having to do the research on what's the best company and et cetera, et cetera. And they help with funding, they help getting you your rebates. And so, look to them if you have any interest in getting solar on your own buildings. Yeah. We need to move into action. We need to break through that will problem because it's worth it now financially, and it's certainly worth it in the long run for future generations.
Thank you. Azra?
3 points. The language matters. Language matters hugely. And if there's one thing that religions provide, it is narrative and language. And so there's much more dexterity and capabilities there to come up with the right language that can unify rather than divide. The second point, I think, has to do with the fact that exactly as my colleagues on the panel have said, the knowledge already exists. The wisdom is already there. And that is by the way, one of the tenets of what Mia Motley has been trying to argue is that we have the resources. The resources actually exist. We also have the knowledge of what needs to be done and how it can be done. And so I think that's something that we often forget because we're so mired in our challenges. As Afifa pointed out earlier, I think there's plenty of wisdom that has yet to be harvested, and that is an opportunity. I also think that, to the point that has been made by so many of you, the examples of what has worked and what is working exist not just when we speak about climate change or the environment. If we see how other forms of mobilization have already happened and are happening on other issues, but we don't sort of look there because we're so focused on environment. If we were to look at what's going on in the gender space or in the poverty space or in the micro-enterprise space or in the debt space, we will find plenty of examples of what is working and what can work. But we need to do that. We need to be intentionally and mindfully cross-pollinating in our activism and in our engagement. But for some reason, we keep falling into those silos again, and we have to be mindful not to do so. Let's learn from what is working across in different movements and spaces.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been, I think, another great conversation building on our first panel. And to remind you, this is part of an ongoing discernment process. The IF20, in partnership with you all, reflecting on the messages we want to share more broadly with the wider public. This is a closed session. As we move toward the gathering in Salt Lake City, we'll have public reports that we'll be sharing, and we'll really be incorporating a lot of the great feedback you've provided. We've heard from all of you here. Now we want to make sure to take a good break for lunch. We have lunch right out here. I'd suggest that we take a full hour and come back at 2:10. That'll give you time to eat for more fellowship. Looks like the rain has stopped. Maybe people want some fresh air. Don't quote me on that, but it might be worth a try. But as we move on to the next phase of our program, please join me in thanking our panelists once again.